Hey everybody, so Cubase 11 is now out. In this video we're going to have a look at all of the new features and then I'll give you my thoughts about it all at the end. There's actually a lot of really cool stuff in this update, so let's get on with it. So first up, let's have a look at the new sample packs that come with Cubase 11. So we've got 6 brand new sample packs. Let's just have a very brief look at each one. So Bloom is a vocals sample pack filled with many different phrases.
Am I here alone again? Funny sometimes. Oh, and I don't know him.
Lots of variation in them and for different tempos, etc. The second pack is the Dance Floor Tech House pack. So again, filled with an absolute ton of different samples. Next up is the Hard Knocks library. This is a hip hop bank. Again, an absolute ton of new samples in there, all highly usable as well. Next up, we've got Lo-Fi drums, which is basically lo-fi hip hop. Then we got a synthwave bank called Nightcall. So again, loads of really cool stuff, everything from one-shots to loops, which seems to be the same for all of these banks. They all have a big mixture of loops and one-shot drums and effects. And lastly, we have Noir, which is a cinematic kind of bank. Some really awesome effects in here actually. So many of these effects will be usable in just standard sort of music for adding a bit of atmosphere to your track, so very cool again. Overall, very nice to have all of these 6 banks added to the update. It always makes it a bit more worthwhile when you've got a whole load more samples coming with Cubase. Okay, so next up is the new sort of updated MIDI editor window. So there are quite a few improvements, so let's go through them. So in the lower zone, you now have ramps and curves, not just steps. So for example, if I go to pitch bend and add a point, I can just draw a ramp between, and now we've also got the same sort of fades as what we have in the automation in the main lanes, which are fully manipulable, makes everything very nice and easy. Now further to the pitch bend editing, some really nice features here which have been added. So for example, in Retrolog, which is the instrument that's linked to at the moment, we've got a pitch bend range of -3 to +3. So we have some added functionality for the pitch bend range. So if we click on this little cogwheel, we can actually have show semitones grid, which as you can see adds in the actual pitch bend amounts. Now at the moment it's set on +2, so all you have to do is come in to the settings and knock this up 1 or 2. You can actually unlink the parameters if you want to, and then I've got my exact pitch bend settings here, so I can just use the lines to either align my pitch bend movements to the semitone, so I know they're exactly going to be in pitch, or I can actually click snap to, and then this will snap to the actual pitches, which is really handy. So you can do some really nice funky stuff and you don't have to sort of fiddle around trying to get everything in the right key. It's all just gonna be nice and easy to use. So other really cool features which have been added to the MIDI editor window is global tracks. So now if you've got global tracks like a ruler, a ranger track, tempo track and any other global tracks, you can actually select them now so they are shown in the MIDI editor window. So if I zoom out, obviously I've got my ranger track sorted so I can see exactly where I am in the project, for example, and the time ruler. And the great thing about these as well is they're all fully manipulatable, so I can change my ranger track, for example, or I can make tempo changes to the project actually in the MIDI editor window itself. Very cool. Now we also have a scale assistant in the MIDI editor window. So what we can do is we can set the scale. So this track is in B minor, for example. And then I can ask it to show the scale note guides. Now you'll notice as I click that, it just updates the sort of shading on the notes. So when it's selected, any notes that are lighter in color are notes in the B minor scale, and any darker are notes outside of the B minor scale. But you can go a lot further than that as well. So this little button up here, we can click and it'll only show the used notes or the keys with any MIDI notes on or MIDI information on. But you can change that as well to show pictures from the scale assistant. So now you can choose to basically blank out any of the notes that aren't in the scale, making this perhaps just a little less confusing for people who are new to music theory. So a really great feature that Steinberg added before was to tell you which notes you could use based on the color, depending on what you had in the chord track. So now you don't have to have the chord track programmed in, you can actually just use the scale assistant. So if you come up to the coloring and go to scale chords, what you'll see is any green notes are in the scale, and as I move this up, any orange notes are notes outside of the scale. You can as well also quantize pitches, for example. Obviously, it might not put it to exactly the right note, but it will put it into the scale. And this is also applicable for live performances. So you can have snap live input on. So any notes that I play on my keyboard are going to just fit in with the scale, which of course can be used for recording, not just actually playing live. So one very neat thing that you can do in Cubase with this new functionality is if you've got the chord track set up. So I've got my basic chords of the song here, B minor, A major, E major. And if I select use chord track, then select chords and then hit record, what I can do is literally press any key on the keyboard and it will actually lock it to what the root notes of the chords showing here are. So using this means all you have to do is concentrate really on the rhythm of what you want to play, and it will automatically snap your bass line to the right notes. So super awesome tool there. You can actually also add custom scales now by going to Project, Chord Track, and then Set Up Musical Scales. So now you can actually add all of these extra scales that they've got listed here, or you can actually make your own scale. So a custom scale, and you choose which notes you want to be part of it. Pretty awesome. So we now have an updated sampler track to version 2.0, and you'll notice a few visual improvements here. So let's just go through what the update entails. So apart from a few sort of visual improvements, we also have now gain controls. You also have a sample normalize function, got like slice mode, which we'll get to in a bit. The pitch mode has been updated slightly, so we've now got an octave control. And we've got LFO functionality, which we'll discuss in a second. We've also got a dedicated filter with plenty of functionality. And lots of different filter types to choose from. The amp section is effectively the same, apart from having LFOs linked to them as well. Okay, so let's just have a look at the LFO and the modulation. So obviously you've got to choose how much of the LFO you want it to affect. There are 2 LFOs, and you can get to those by clicking the mod button, and you can choose between which LFO you want to tweak. So obviously we've got 1 is selected to modulate the filter at the moment. As you can hear, we can sync these, of course, to the tempo and have it on retrig if we want, or we can have it just free, tempo and beat. We can choose the shape of the LFO, we can change the frequency and obviously the timings of it as well. And these LFOs obviously can be applied to whatever function you like. So you can apply it to the amp, you can apply it to the pitch, whatever you want. So one nice thing is that even when you're filtering something, the waveform is updated. So as I filter it, you can see what's left. So you can actually see where the high frequencies and low frequencies are sort of located within the sound itself. So back in the main section, we now have slice mode. So when you activate that, you've got the normal sort of threshold control to be able to select the amount of slices that you want. And you'll notice that once the slices have been selected, the piano roll sort of updates, and now all of these slices are mapped to the individual keys. So you can then play them on your MIDI keyboard, or just create a MIDI track to recreate them. And this also works exactly the same way in which slices do in the audio editor. So you can select, delete, hold Alt to change or add warp markers, or delete if you want, and you can preview any slice just by clicking on it. Now, one cool thing with this is that you have a MIDI drag button, so I can actually drag the MIDI out into my project, and what it does is it just has mapped every single slice here and just put it in MIDI format So if I want, I can then just play around with that and make a new beat. So envelopes in the sampler control can now be synced to tempo. Just means they'll snap, as you can see. So like with the snapping of pitches, it just makes it easier to make sure everything's nice and precise with your editing. There are many other small improvements with this, like being able to move the start and end locators at the same time, better integration with instruments like Groove Agent and Backbone Pad Shop, for example. So if we make a selection, I can choose to transfer that to a new instrument. Now, one of the best things about this is that with Backbone, it has a resynthesis engine, and if you have Audio Warp selected with warp mode on, it will import the sample into Backbone and automatically set it to resynth mode, and will set it to the same speed, which is really awesome. So moving on in the score editor. Now, as we see most years with the score editor, a general all-round upgrade has happened. The things of note here is the score editor has been sort of tidied up a bit and now has a right-hand zone, which has a properties inspector that will update depending on what score element is selected, rather than having separate windows or panels like it used to have. You now have note length and velocity overlays, which borrow from the key editor, which is a nice touch, and will also help those new to scoring to understand what the different note symbols mean as they're getting used to it. The score editor also now has Smuffle, standard music font layout support, but that is really pretty advanced and for developing your own musical fonts or making notation software. Okay, so let's look at the new and updated plugins which come with Cubase 11. So the first one I want to look at is this one called Squasher, which is a new dynamic plugin, and it's pretty awesome. It's another multi-band effect which you can't get enough of, and each band has simultaneously a downward and upward compressor. So very quickly, for those wondering what an upward compressor is, well, with a standard downward compressor, you set the threshold level, and any signal that goes over that threshold gets turned down by whatever amount you set the ratio to. Now with an upward compressor, you set the threshold level and then anything that goes below it gets turned up. So it's just another way of reducing or controlling the dynamic range of a signal. So that's what this section here is, the upward and downward compressors, and you can choose how much you want. You also have a gate effect for each band and a drive, so it's like saturation basically for each band that you can add. And of course all of this can be sidechained as well, depending on what you've got set up in your project. So rather than really explain any more about it, I'm just going to play you a couple of examples of how this works. So first of all, this is just on an overall mix. Now, I don't suggest actually doing this, but I'm just going to cycle through a couple of the presets so you can sort of get an idea of what's going on. Let's start with the bypassed. So it can have quite nice clarifying effects on an overall mix, although I don't really think that's exactly what it's meant to be for. Better to be used on something like guitars. So Squasher, very good plugin for squashing things, funnily enough. So next up on the new plugins of the list is the multi-band imager. And using this, you can independently adjust the stereo image in your defined frequency range. So a very common one, of course, is to mono the bass, for example. So we can just turn that down. And you get a good insight into what is happening in the stereo mix of your track. And of course you are able to expand the width of each band as well. You can remove bands if you want, 4 is the maximum, but you can change this to a simple 2 band just to isolate the bass of your track, whatever you want. But it has all the normal functions of a multi-band plugin, like being able to solo just the bass, or any other frequency range. So next up, and I'm sure a lot of you will be glad to see this, we finally have a metering plugin, or a dedicated metering plugin for Cubase, and it's a really great tool. It allows full customization, so it looks pretty basic as it stands, but we can obviously customize what we want to observe. We can also add multiple sort of modules to this as well. So if I split this, we can also add to the bottom as well. And this is fully expandable. So we can have multiple imaging going on. So it's a very powerful plugin for those of you who want a very visual insight into the music that you're creating. And it's nice to finally have a really powerful and usable imager plugin dedicated for Cubase. So the last thing in this section is an update to the frequency EQ. So this is already a really great and powerful EQ. Now it has been further improved with a new dynamic feature. So dynamic EQ is not new. Other third-party plugins like FabFilter Pro Q3, Isotope Neutron and Ozone have it, but it is an advanced feature that you now have in Cubase, which is great, as some of those plugins that I mentioned are well over £100. So the way dynamic EQ works is sort of the same way that a compressor works, that you set the threshold level, and then when a signal goes over that threshold, the signal gets turned down. So with dynamic EQ, you set the threshold, choose how much you want it to reduce the volume by, or increase the volume, depending on how you have the EQ band set. Choose your attack and release settings, and then when you play it, you'll see that when this particular frequency goes over that threshold level, it's going to reduce just this EQ band. So basically it's just taking the sort of muddiness, if you like, out of the kick in this particular example. Now uses for this are various, but a couple of examples like I've just shown you is to reduce the muddiness of a kick in a mix, or you may have two elements in a track that are sort of adding together and making the mix a little harsh. Well, you can set the EQ to trigger automatically at those particular points and reduce that particular harsh frequency, kind of like a de-esser but with much more control. Having this feature, of course, isn't going to suddenly mean that you are going to become an amazing mixing engineer. Not like that at all. It's just another tool that you've got in your toolbox. So one update to Cubase 11 which we got is that any plugin that has a sidechain input capability now also can support multiple sidechain inputs. So you can have, say, 8 channels feeding the sidechain, and you can then apply each sidechain differently for each EQ band within frequency, which allows you a level of control that has not really been seen before. So the export capability has now been greatly improved. So apart from being visually more clear with the actual colours of the tracks shown in the channel selection here, the whole sort of export functionality has been greatly improved and streamlined. So previously rendering out multiple stems with, say, different ranges or different processing, or rendering multiple file types was really tedious, as you had to basically do each one individually. Or you could do multiple tracks at a time, but then you'd have to go in, change the settings in Cubase, and then go back to the export window and do it all over again. So now you effectively have these sort of existing render in place options for each and every track, which means you can choose to render out each track either with just the dry channel settings, with the channel settings, but not the group settings, or the complete signal chain. So really powerful, because it means that when you want to render out basically dry and wet stems, you can do both at the same time, which is going to save people a whole lot of time. So we now have an export queue function, which we click on to expand. And then when you're happy with your selection, you can just, of the tracks that you want to export, you just click add to queue, and it will add all the tracks that you want to export. And if I want to export, say, the same tracks, but I want to export them completely dry, then I just select that here and then go add to queue. And we'll have our second set of jobs all rendering out completely dry. So there's a whole lot more to it. You can choose locator settings and a whole load more. But once you've done everything that you want, you can just go start export and it'll do the whole lot in one go. And just a few other improvements to the export window as well. So in your project, if you've got multiple tracks selected, and these are the ones that you want to export, when you go to the export window, you can actually go sync selection to channel track list, and there you go, you've got your 4 channels that were selected in the project showing up here. Also, what you can add to the queue is different file types as well. So let's say these 4 I want to export just as MP3, so I can just select them and go add to queue. And there we go, we're going to have MP3 versions of all of those tracks that I've selected. So there are a load of other ton of little improvements with this window. I'm not going to go into them all here, but it really is a nice improvement to the export window, much more functionality and a much more streamlined workflow for those who need to render out multiple file types, different locations and or dry or wet settings. So HiDPi settings have finally been improved. So now instead of just the HiDPi settings working at 200% zoom, which is pretty useless, it now works at 25% increments with Windows scaling. Now it doesn't work at percentages in between 25% increments, but it's still absolutely fine. Most people use 25% increments anyway, so happy days. Now on this topic, all of the instruments, Retrolog, Halion, PadShop, have all been updated to the new sort of HiDPi standards, so they'll scale across 25% increments as well, with the exclusion of Groove Agent because that was already done in the last Cubase release. And whilst we're on the subject of the instruments, they've all been updated with various bug fixes as well. So those are really the main features. There are a ton of other little improvements, like marker events have been made clearer, focus indication when using divide track list has been improved, poly pressure lane handling has been improved, the combined select and range tool has been improved for slightly better workflow, names of track versions have been neatened up, mixed console window behavior has been improved, so if it's hidden behind another window, for example, you no longer have to press F3 twice, once to close it and then again to load it up and bring it to the forefront. It just brings it straight to the forefront, so it detects if it's behind another window or not. Couple of other selections possible in the logical editor window, so you can select all high or low notes, for example. A few more plugins have been updated graphically. So that's it for the overview of all the new features. Time for my thoughts and conclusion. So let's go through this from the beginning. So the sample packs, I love the fact that there's 6 new sample packs. Obviously they're not going to suit everybody, but then if you think about it, you know, the cost of a sample pack times 6 is going to be anywhere between sort of 50 and 100 quid. So that's kind of just added into the value of the update, which is just a nice thing to have. So I really like the new sort of MIDI editor functionality. I think that's fantastic. It's not like it's been redone to the point where you won't recognize the MIDI editor. All of the same functionality is there, exactly the same, except it's just got all this additional stuff on top, like the ability to add the global tracks, all the ramps and curves in the controller lanes, and of course the help for people that are sort of new to music theory, like being able to just show the pitches in a particular scale and everything. I think all of these things just really help Cubase become more and more accessible, even though it's a proper pro level DAW. So Sample Track version 2 is really cool, not just for sort of EDM producers, but also from a sound design perspective as well. I think it's going to be quite helpful for a lot of people. Not sure how much I'm personally going to use all of the new functionality of it, but it doesn't matter, it's there if I need it, so that's good. I like it. I love Squasher. It's a completely crazy plugin and you can get some really extreme compression results, but I've been messing around with it a bit since the sort of main chunk of the video was recorded, and I'm actually really liking it. It can give a really cool sort of feel to some parts, particularly individual parts, drums, guitar, vocals, etc. Definitely requires some tweaking, and definitely going to take a while to sort of get used to using both an upward and downward compressor at the same time together with saturation and everything like that, but it's definitely really cool. It's a very, very powerful plugin, and the fact that it's multi-band, yeah, defo good. So I really love the new analysis tools. They're really good. The way it works and the way it all sort of bolts together so you can have multiple different analysis tools is really neat. Going to be very helpful for a lot of people. So the update to Frequency 2 is nice. To be able to have dynamic EQ now built into Cubase is really quite cool. It's definitely a sort of more advanced technique to be able to use, but you know, obviously nothing wrong with that, that's good, but definitely requires some fiddling to get it exactly right. But for sure, it's a great feature to have built into Cubase. So for me, those are sort of the main updates. Obviously, I mean, I don't really use a score editor much, so it doesn't really affect me. The export window being improved is going to be like helpful maybe a couple of times a year for me, but when I do need it, it is going to be really helpful to be able to render out dry and wet versions of all your stems. At the same time, it's just really cool, and it's going to help a lot of people for sure. So yes, it's a nice touch, even if it is only used infrequently. So I'm kind of trying to think of what I actually disliked about the update, and I don't really think there's anything that I dislike about it. There's nothing, I mean, Cubase isn't perfect. You know, it's not that it can't be improved further, of course it will be, but I mean, about the actual update itself, nothing that stands out to me is like, oh, why did they do that, or, you know, it seems like it's interrupted my workflow or made it worse. Everything that's in there, especially the small little tweaks, are just slight improvements all around. So, you know, as someone who uses Cubase heavily, it's just nice to have all those sort of small tweaks to the workflow. Every time an update comes to Cubase, it just gets a little bit better. They add some really cool features, Squasher, the sample packs, everything like that, all the improvements to the MIDI editor window. They're just really nice improvements, and they just make it a better place to work, really. A nicer environment, a quicker environment to sort of get your job done. So yeah, overall, I really like this update. I think it's definitely worth the money for me. I'm going to upgrade instantly. But you know, obviously you guys have to make up your own mind about whether it's worth it for you or not. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. But yeah, overall, I'm impressed. I think it's really cool. Well done, Steinberg. So that's it for my overview and review of Cubase 11. I really hope it was helpful for you. Just so you know, we have a beginner's tutorial already made for Cubase 11. The actual song you can hear in the background is the one that you get to make in the tutorial, obviously with vocals added as well. And in that course, you'll learn all about Cubase and how it works, how the interface works, how to make drums, how to record guitar, vocals, how to arrange a song, how to mix it all down and make it sound good, and basically everything that you need to be able to make your own music in Cubase. So if you're interested in that, then check it out. We also have loads of other Cubase courses, more advanced courses as well. Check out that from the link in the description below. Thanks very much for watching, guys and girls. See you in the next one.